So I'll be presenting my journal club today from an article titled Stent Graft versus Balloon Angioplasty for Failing Dialysis Access Grafts. And this was published at the New England Journal of Medicine in 2010 by Haskell et al. Going to review this interesting article today. So, as an introduction, over 341,000 patients in the US are on hemodialysis, and this I believe is 2008 data. Also, vascular access complications account for 16 to 25% of hospital admissions of patients with end-stage renal disease in the United States. Clearly, it's a big problem. It's costing over $1 billion per year, and many of our dialysis patients, despite the Fistula First initiative, still rely on arteriovenous grafts for their dialysis. For some reason, some of these patients have to have an AV graft instead of a fistula. The cost of maintaining vascular access is substantial. It's up to 62,000 per patient per year for a failing graft. Neointimal stenosis has been found to develop at the site of venous anastomosis of AV graft and resulting in a secondary patency. That by this we mean patency after an intervention of 50% for AV grafts at 3 years. There's no reported mechanical or endovascular or pharmacological approach to fixing these grafts that seems to compare better than a balloon angioplasty. So for years now, the gold standard for managing an AV graft has been pretty much the balloon angioplasty. So this study was designed to kind of see if there's any benefit of having a graft compared to angioplasty. So the study hypothesis was that the revision of a venous anastomotic stenosis with a stent graft constructed with the same material as the graft would prevent elastic recoil and tissue ingrowth and hopefully improve the long-term patency and as compared to that from a balloon angioplasty. And so what did they do? Majorly, the study was designed to use a PTFE stent and in some to manage an arteriovenous graft and stenosis and compare what your treatment findings after your intervention has been done. It was a prospective multi-center randomized controlled trial. Patients were eligible if they had been on had end-stage renal disease and were undergoing hemodialysis with the use of a failing but not a thrombosed AV graft. So it was a failing graft but not yet thrombosed. As mentioned earlier, the study objective was to demonstrate that the treatment with a stent graft was not inferior to treatment with a balloon angioplasty alone regarding the primary endpoint. And we're talking about the primary endpoint soon. However, on the inclusion and exclusion criteria, the slide's somewhat busy, but they did have some detailed inclusions. Interesting, patients age of 18 to 90 were randomized to the study, and they had to have at least greater than 50% graft vein, greater than 50% stenosis at the graft vein anastomosis. There were also some key exclusion criteria. Of course, no concomitant disease like cancer or anything terminal that would result in death within 6 months. And the other exclusion criteria were all listed down there, as you can see. So, how's randomization done? Well, if you had a lesion that met criteria, and as you read from the inclusion criteria, it had to be a greater than 50% stenosis, and it had to be within 3 centimeters of the AV, actually vein graft anastomosis, or um, yeah, the vein graft anastomosis within 3 centimeters of it, and there was some other criteria as listed. So if you met criteria of a lesion that needed intervention, everybody had a balloon angioplasty done. And after you had the balloon angioplasty done, the second step was they were randomized from that point either to get a stent graft placed or no further intervention. So a total of 190 patients were enrolled in the study. 97 of them were randomized to um, the stent graft, while 93 were randomized to the balloon angioplasty alone. Now, the goal of treatment was to achieve a less than 30% stenosis in the treatment area. So the endpoint, the primary endpoint was a 6 months, was at 6 months primary patency of a stenotic venous anastomosis in the treatment area. So we were looking at patency at 6 months. Also, they had some secondary endpoints. There were some safety variables that were analyzed. They had definitions for what they call procedural success, which was successful percutaneous insertion of the stent graft. There was a primary patency of the access circuit at 2nd and at 6 months. Also, the percent stenosis of the treatment area at the 2nd and at the 6 month mark. And then freedom from subsequent intervention were all listed as secondary endpoints. And this is a very busy slide, but it had the characteristics of the study patients as well as characteristics of their access graft at baseline according to the treatment group. The major thing to note was that the randomization seemed to have equal distribution of patients with pretty much similar access details on the two arms of the study. They listed a whole lot of stuff. I probably couldn't pick out one key thing to start analyzing here, but it'd be nice to look through. But it was probably nicely or well done randomization. So the results of their finding showed that the primary patency of the treatment area was significantly greater in the stent graft group, and by that they found there was a 51% patency than in the balloon angioplasty group, which had just 23%, and this was statistically significant with a p-value. Also, they found that the incidence of primary patency of the access circuit, which they had the definition for as the access, as the entire circuit of access from the anastomotic point all the way up to the superior vena cava right atrium junction. So it was reported that the incidence of primary patency of this access circuit was higher with the stent graft at 38% versus the angioplasty at 20%, and this was also statistically significant. So the reported procedural success was significantly higher in the stent graft with 93% versus 73% in the angioplastic group. This was significant also. In the stent graft group at 6 months, the key findings were that the minimum lumen diameter was greater in the stent graft. Also, the average percent stenosis was less. There was any stenosis greater than 50% was found to be less in the stent group, as well as restenotic lesions were shorter in that group also. And after they did their logistic regression, the only criterion associated with primary patency was found to be the stent graft. Now, they have definitions for these terms, but this table shows you what the treatment success and patency endpoints in the study according to groups showed. Um, so what they called anatomical success was statistically significant in the stent group with 94% anatomic success versus 73% success. There was also statistically significant difference in the procedural success of 94% in the stent versus 73% in the balloon angioplasty, as well as in the primary patency, the significance was at 6 months. Really, within the second 2 to 6 months, there were no significant difference between the procedures of stenting and angioplasty. However, at 6 months, it showed that the patency obviously was higher in the stent group at 51% compared to the balloon angioplasty at 23%. And we're going to see a separation curve showing this also soon. Um, Same finding when you talk about the primary patency of the access circuit. I mean, the entire access to the right atrium was significantly different at 6 months between the stent group and the angioplasty group. Now, these were the definitions which I left to this point so that we can, if you have to read them, it's quite a little detailed. They had good definitions for what outcomes they were going to evaluate. And I guess we can read this at our convenience. And this was a separation curve that showed that this difference became evident at the 6 month mark. Clearly, there was no difference in the first 2 months, but as you move towards the 6 month mark, was separation between the stent and the balloon angioplasty in the primary patency, as we found between 51 and 30 something percent in the angioplasty group. Now, same thing also in the circuit access, the same separation occurred at 6 months. But as encouraging as their study showed some difference, it's clear that the life of a graft is steadily on the decline, as we can see. As a sloping graph that trends downwards over time. And eventually, at some point out there, you're going to need to have more intervention done to these grafts. In terms of safety and adverse events, the only difference that they noted that was statistically significant was that the incidence of wrist stenosis was higher with the balloon angioplasty. It was 77% versus 40% in the standard group, and as mentioned, this was statistically significant. Otherwise, there was no other significant difference in the reported adverse events between the two groups. And there's a table showing all the parameters looked at in terms of adverse effects, and as mentioned, it was only the wrist stenosis that showed some significant statistical significance. So I've bunched some high points and limitations of the study, of which I think the study had a detailed assessment and definitions of patency using angiographic data, and that was key because they got their data using angiogram. So everybody got an angiogram at 2 months as well as 6 months, and this was not data extrapolated by clinical performance of the stent as most other studies have used. This data was gotten by objective measurements, and the angiographic data actually details of this was in the supplementary text, but they had this sent out and had them reviewed by independent peer review. Um, so they did get objective data in terms of their measurements because they were angiographically done and not clinically correlated really. Um, Also, it was a randomized control study, which typically is higher value as compared to some of the retrospective studies we have. Um, and then the limitation was obviously a short duration. It was a 6 months follow-up study, and truly, it does appear that 6 months in the life of a graft obviously is a big deal. But we would love to see data further down to know how these grafts perform beyond this point. Um, and that was one of the limitations of short study. So overall, the conclusion was that a PTFE stent graft is superior to a balloon angioplasty for the treatment of an AV graft um, with venous anastomotic stenosis. Also, as compared with balloon angioplasty, the stent graft was associated with graft function for a longer period before subsequent intervention, and a graft lumen that had a greater diameter and had patency for a longer period. So essentially, this was the brief analysis of this study and its interesting report. Uh, Thank you.